Our story today begins with a guy named Zebulon. Zebulon Pike is his name, Sam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a Star Trek podcast, right?
It is. Well, we might have to do that.
Yeah.
Actually, there are some. We're going to be talking about crazy worlds. We're going to be talking about mixing military conquest and changing cultures and markets. So the story we're going to talk about today in Mary Wingerd's book North Country might not be so far away from a Star Trek story.
Yeah, Captain Pike taking us exploring, boldly going to where no white man has gone before.
Where no white man who speaks English has gone before.
That's closer. Actually, so my joke there, Logan, works on multiple levels because Captain Pike is actually a Star Trek character and Zebulon just sounds alien. So that's kind of where it's kind of it's not quite a double entendre, but it's a layered nerdy joke because I'm referencing something bizarre from Minnesota and United States history, just kind of this notable person, but also tying it into the Star Trek franchise. So it just kind of works on multiple layers there. I'm Sam Temple. Welcome to the 1855 podcast.
I'm Logan Ledman.
Yeah.
Well, we're happy to welcome everyone listening, no matter what planet you live on, to our this is our fourth episode of the podcast, going through Mary Lethert Wingerd's book North Country. And as we've said in previous episodes, it's a great book, a really lovely, a well-told story, but a dense one that Sam and I are here to walk through with you, our listeners, to get a glimpse of, really more than a glimpse, a very deep dive into Minnesota history.
Yeah, so whether you read the book along with us or you are just here for the ramblings of two friends talking about this history book, welcome. That brings us to 1805, where U.S. Army Lieutenant Zebulon Pike is coming up on what would eventually be Minnesota. Logan, what is our man Zebulon Pike doing here in the North Country?
A good way to think about it is that it's concurrent with Lewis and Clark's expedition west. It is the much less famous version, essentially, of that trip. They went all the way west of the Pacific coast, and Zebulon Pike went to Minneapolis, essentially. What would become Minneapolis. And he also, so
it's exciting.
Lewis and Clark were sent by yeah, that's right. Lewis and Clark were sent by Thomas Jefferson. Zebulon Pike was sent by James Wilkinson, the general of the army. So Pike's up here doing a similar thing as Lewis and Clark, mapping out the territory for the United States. This is coming just after the much of the western half of Minnesota is purchased in the Louisiana territory. So the idea is he's coming up here to map out the land. Wilkinson, our friend Wilkinson, Wingerd points out as one of the most corrupt political figures of the 19th century. And if you know anything about the 19th century, it's corruption in American government is kind of the rule of the game in the 19th century. So Wilkinson is
he's a good player.
He's a good player at the game. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
He knows Wingerd suspects a man named Pierre Chouteau, who was a fur trade bigwig working out of St. Louis.
There's got to be
deeply tied.
There's got to be a pun somewhere in Chouteau.
There probably is, and I'm sure you'll stumble upon it somehow.
Okay, well, if I'm silent for a while, I'm trying to work that out.
Okay, good. Wilkinson and Chouteau are working together, Wingerd suspects, on the Mississippi River fur trade heading up into Minnesota. And so that is the incentive to send young Lieutenant, 22? Young Lieutenant Zebulon, 26-year-old Zebulon Pike up into Minnesota to map out the area and make connections with the Dakota and Ojibwe.
Mm-hmm. And basically what Pike eventually makes contact with the Dakota, and they actually have their first, what is considered by the Americans to be the first meeting of a United States government official with the Dakota people. and it is on a small island near the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi on what is today known as Pike Island. And that is just below what would eventually become Fort Snelling. And at this meeting, Pike kind of overplays his hand in how much power he's actually been given by the United States government. So he makes all these promises to the Dakota, and in return, the United States government will be able to make a fort on the bluff above the meeting of these two rivers. And by the time that message reaches Washington, Washington's kind of like, no one told you to do that, Zebulon. Not really your place. But they did it, and the United States government basically agreed to follow through with it, except for the amount of money and the things that they were going to give the Dakota, but they were still going to get their fort. So right. Basically agreed to the same thing, just not as much benefit for the Dakota people. So, that's how that's going. But it took a while. It took a while, yeah. And it would be it would be more than 15 years until a fort was actually produced and the goods were actually provided for the Dakota, even if it was a smaller amount than they had actually agreed to with our good friend Zebulon.
Yeah, and part of the reason it takes so long is that a war happens a little bit after this expedition hopes to set up some nice partnerships up there. The War of 1812 begins in, believe it or not, in 1812.
Historians, people, gotta love them.
You really do. That's a war that, it's not really it's not a blockbuster war. Tom Hanks hasn't done a movie about it quite yet.
If this war would be a January release movie.
It would be a January release, yeah. Maybe, at this point, probably direct to streaming, not going to the theaters.
Yeah. Actually, direct to streaming is usually better than a January release. If you're getting a theatrical release in January, you're bad. Shuto.
Okay, all right. Yeah, you're still working on a pun? Okay.
Yep.
We'll see if you get there.
Okay.
So, the relations between the United States and Britain... you got something?
I got it.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so I don't have it as much as I thought I did. But,
all right, awesome.
It's what the soldiers for the British in the War of 1812 would threaten to do to the American soldiers if they saw them on the battlefield.
What's that?
Shuto! Shoot you! No,
that's great. I think that's probably about as good as it's going to get.
Well, that's offensive to me.
In 1807, the United States had cut off trade relations with Britain, which was actually an enormous move, setting a trade embargo in response to a lot of international affairs that are more complicated than we need to get into here. But in between 1807 and 1812, things get crazy between the United States and Britain, leading to all-out war in 1812. A war with some consequences for the people living far out in the west, the Dakota, the Ojibwe, the French-Canadian fur traders, and the scattered small numbers of American representatives who live on the land. Specifically, like Sam just mentioned, for the Dakota, the lack of real benefit to the councils with Pike led to tensions. And many of the most prominent members of especially the Mdewakanton tribe of the Dakotas, we're talking about people like Wabasha and Wakinyatonka, also known as Little Crow. You'll hear both of those names a lot more once we get into the 1850s and 60s. So remember Wabasha and Little Crow. Little Crow you might already be familiar with because Little Crow is a title passed down from father to son in the Mdewakanton Kaposia tribe. Little Crow the Fourth will become immensely important in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. But this is Little Crow the Third, his father.
Yeah, Little Crow the Third, Wakinyatonka, is also sometimes called Big Thunder by historians.
That's right.
So again, some of that's translation, some of that's cultural. Lack of clarity between the Dakota scholars trying to communicate with English or British or French scholars. So in this chapter, when we talk about Little Crow, we're talking about Wakanyatanka or Big Thunder. But
the point is, among many leaders in the Dakota tribe, allegiances fall on the side of the British rather than the Americans out west. And so men like Little Crow, like Wabasha, and even mixed bloods like Joseph Renville, who also played important roles as interpreters and the like. Joseph Renville specifically was an interpreter at the meeting between Zebulon Pike and the Dakota that we talked about earlier today. They serve as generals of British forces, of Indian forces working on behalf of the British in the War of 1812. And they win all of their battles. Fairly handily.
Which is better than, obviously, the American or the British in this war.
That's right, yeah. Talk about the conclusion of the war.
Yeah, so the reason that this is a January release is it feels like it's got all the makings of a great sequel. The OG bad guy is coming back. There's new conflicts. There's new allies. There's kind of a reorienting. Before, it was all on the east. Now there's stuff coming in from the north and the west. It feels like it's got all the build-up. But then in the third act, it just kind of fizzles out.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happens with the War of 1812. It amounts to pretty much a draw, but there was enough language around it that the Americans could feel like they won, the British could feel like they won, and everyone left happy except for the indigenous people. But it basically just ended as a draw. The trouble is, especially for the Dakota warriors fighting for the British, they were promised essentially their own nation, their own state that would be a buffer between basically British Canada and the United States. They were promised their own territory, their own Indian nation, and the British obviously backed out on that because they got enough of what they wanted from the draw and left. So that obviously left the Dakota in quite a bad place and not too fond of the British. So I'm going to quote from page 81 of Shifting Ground. Quote, "The Indians felt deeply betrayed. Dakota allies had traveled far from their homes to fight alongside the British and had been promised an Indian nation. They had won every battle and were left empty-handed. When the British tried to appease them with gifts, Little Crow, Wakanyatanka, spoke from the heart of the Dakota people. Little Crow said, quote, 'After we have fought for you, endured many hardships, lost some of our people, and awakened the vengeance of our powerful neighbors, you make a peace for yourselves and leave us to obtain such terms as we can. You no longer need our services and offer us these goods as a compensation for having deserted us. But no, we will not take them. We will hold them and yourselves in equal contempt.' End quote. End quote." So there's Wakanyatanka. Basically, that's a summary of the Dakota breaking things off with the British. And really what happens with Wakanyatanka and several others, in 1818, so a little after the war has ended, a handful of Dakota travel to the American fort at Prairie du Chien. They hand over their British flags and medals, quote, "cheered the American president and denounced the British king, making the best of a bad situation. Their primary interest was still to establish a stable trading relationship. Whether the Union Jack or the Stars and Stripes flew over the desired post was irrelevant to them." End quote. So that's how the Dakotas continued to maintain a relationship with the fur trade, this time just shifting more to the Americans than to the British.
And that's an important fact, too, is that the war is a draw. One thing that it does is it confirms that Americans are going to be the people in charge of the Minnesota area. If the British had won, perhaps they could have taken part of the upper Midwest in new territory. That was potentially one of their goals, but it didn't work out.
Or even negotiated a peace differently.
Right, sure. Yeah, they could have negotiated a peace differently. You're right. But what happens is that the Americans are the ones in charge. So what does that mean for the traders on the ground? Wingerd gives a list of names on page 83, just lists them off, including people like Jean-Baptiste Faribault and Alexis Bailey, who perhaps we'll talk about later, mixed ancestry fur traders who had been involved in the trade for generations at this point, and had most recently been British citizens, some of whom I think there's a story out there that Jean-Baptiste was a spy during the War of 1812.
Dun dun dun.
So they're people whose loyalties are definitely not explicitly American, but they all, after the War of 1812, they all line up and apply for American citizenship, and as she writes, continue business as usual. So that's the main change as a result of the War of 1812, is the shift in allegiance now formally away from the British towards the Americans.
And I can hear all the Star Trek fans and Minnesota history nerds alike, along with the people who fell asleep to this podcast, asking, where's our good friend Zebulon Pike? Okay, well, he's dead. But the trading post and the military fort, rather, at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, now that the War of 1812 is over, is making progress. So rest in peace, Zebulon Pike. We'll move forward with this deal that you didn't have permission to negotiate. In 1819, construction begins in Fort Snelling. At first, it's a bit of a mess, but then the U.S. Army brings in Josiah Snelling, Colonel Josiah Snelling, and he basically whips everyone into shape and finishes the fort. And for such an honor, they name the fort Fort Snelling. And that is in
24.
24, thank you.
That's right. We're on page 90 now, talking about Fort Snelling. And it is, I hope everyone who's listening has been there. If you haven't, it's strongly recommended. It's a really, it's well situated for what it is supposed to be. Right above the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, overlooking that entire expansive land, at a really crucial juncture. And it's, as Wingerd writes, it's an imposing fortification. But things are not really as they might seem. It is not a well-oiled military machine that is put together in 1824.
Yeah, well, and we'll get into just kind of how chaotic this essentially this new settlement, the birth of Minnesota, as we are beginning to know it. The purpose of this fort might have been passed off as imperial expansion or some sort of manifest destiny. But really what it came down to was this fort was to stop furs from land that, quote, belonged to the United States, stopping furs and goods harvested there from going to fur traders in British Canada. That was really the primary goal of this fort, was to stop that trade and make sure that anything that is harvested in American territory is sent back and traded and taxed and profited through the United States. That is really the primary goal of this fort. And then, like Logan was saying, not really that efficient in that, other than giving an American presence in this new territory.
Yeah, there are a couple things that, all right, let's start. The garrison's mission, which is to act as a civilizing force, is part of their goal once they end up there. I'll read this section, Sam, towards the bottom of page 90. In practical terms, this left the common soldiers with almost nothing to do, especially over the long winters. Generally speaking, they were a motley lot. The army filled the ranks of frontier posts with the dregs of the service, convicts, chronic deserters, and other desperados. The soldiers filled their days with card-playing, drinking, and quarreling. Provisions often ran low, but the commandant made up for it with generous daily rations of whiskey. According to one female resident at the fort, sometimes it seemed that about all they had was whiskey. Wingerd writes she recalled that intemperance among both officers and men at that time was an almost universal thing, and produced deplorable effects. Wingerd writes even the redoubtable Colonel Snelling was known to indulge in frequent convivial spells to buck up his morale. She goes on to write that maintaining any semblance of discipline among men he described as convicts and refuse and foreigners was a constant struggle. Snelling says, she writes, "Whiskey is their god and mutiny their watchword." Wingerd writes, "These denizens of Fort Snelling were unlikely to spread civilization among the, quote, savage tribes."
And a lot of that is because, like we've talked about in the past, there are small skirmishes between either different bands of the Dakota, but mostly between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. But that's not a unified war effort like what the United States would consider war. So them being brought there to bring peace, like Logan said, didn't really do that much, and most of the time the men were just drinking. But Logan, what about the ladies?
That's a great question.
Yeah, there are women in Minnesota too. Minnesota can be women too. And there were some here. So there's one quote that Wingerd puts in that, compared to the rough conditions of a particularly bad experience, quote, "Society at the fort at that period was of the most select and aristocratic," end quote. So on the one hand, you have the soldiers that are raucous and drunkards, and on the other hand, you have the people living and trying to basically make a living and raise their profile through the fort. And part of that was through the women that were living there. I quote Wingerd, "The women set themselves to the task of countering not only the unsavory habits of the soldiers, but also the alien culture of the borderland society. They made their homes a haven of civilization, with furnishings, china, decorative items, and even a piano laboriously hauled up the river. They established Sunday services and arranged tea parties, receptions, balls, and theatricals to break the monotony of life at the fort. They studied French with a veteran of Napoleon's army, and oversaw the proper education of their children. By 1823, Colonel Snelling had engaged a Harvard-educated tutor to provide officers' children with a classical education that included the rudiments of Greek and Latin," end quote. So as much as things can be simplified to, the women were doing this, the men were doing this, the soldiers were doing this, obviously it's a lot more complicated overall. Everyone, whether it was class or gender, everyone was doing what they could in the roles that were given to them at the time, and specifically for the women at Fort Snelling, using the roles that they were allowed to have at this time as wives, homemakers. We talked a little bit about Republican motherhood in a previous episode. They really start to build up the culture of what would become Minnesota, because regardless of the intention, if it is just to have a military fort, whether it's to regulate trade, when you gather people together, regardless of how they got there, it creates a community, and it creates a wholly unique and new kind of culture. And that's what was happening at Fort Snelling in the early 1820s.
Yeah, and worth mentioning quickly, too, that of the women you're talking about, they're, the wives of officers of the fort,
mm-hmm.
Not necessarily the dregs of society that we were talking about before, but the people who are trying to climb the rungs of society are bringing their wives to Minnesota as well, and those are the kinds of people who are making their homes in Minnesota and starting to establish families too. We'll talk a little bit more about the new kinds of people that are coming to Minnesota later.
Yeah. So, like we said, Fort Snelling is here to essentially regulate the fur trade. But who's doing the fur trade? Well, that's the traders for the American Fur Company. That's right. How's the American Fur Company doing? Not too good. So pretty much as soon as Minnesota starts to look like it's possibly maybe becoming a thing, the fur trade is already on the way out. But it has a very long and agonizing death. And one of the symptoms of that death is credit. By the 1820s, the American Fur Company, and even before that really, the American Fur Company was functioning almost entirely on credit. So I quote Wingerd on page 92 of North Country. Quote, "If the season's pelts failed to cover the advance, the debt fell wholly on the traders. If bad luck or poor management drove the trader out of business, all his assets were forfeit to the company, including any outstanding Indian debts," end quote. So debts that essentially were owed to the Indians, in one way or another, all wound up back with the American Fur Company. And as we've said before, due to international politics, due to supply and demand, due to weather, poor hunting seasons, the fur trade is just not a profitable business at this point. It had been used as a tool of international politics, of empire making, but now it's really on its way out, and as less and less importance is put on that, either because international politics is not as big of an issue or the fur trade isn't the best tool for it. It returns to essentially needing to make money, and the fur trade at this point is not good at that, largely because of the credit that they are functioning off of.
Yeah, there are two major effects of that shift towards a credit model that I want to talk about. One of them is it engenders a culture of market hunting among the Dakota and Ojibwe, where the focus of their relationship with the fur trade has to increasingly be less about hunting just enough to survive and provide some stuff to the fur trade, but this cycle of debt and credit means that hunting simply for the market has to occur in order to procure enough credit to survive, to purchase other trade for other necessities. There's this cycle of debt and dependency and market hunting that leads to overhunting and to greater and greater dependency on the failing fur companies. And there's a second effect as well, which is it changes the culture of fur trading itself. The kind of person that the fur companies are looking for is no longer a man who can establish friendly relationships with indigenous people or someone who can navigate rough situations well. It's become someone who can manage credit effectively, someone who you can trust with credit, with overseeing a business, someone who's a gentleman in the understanding of the times. And this is where a man named Henry Hastings Sibley enters the story as the ideal candidate.
Theme music. Title music.
That's right.
The main character anthem alert comes in. It's a slow motion. He's entering the frame. We're panning up. I don't know why I settled on movies this time.
I don't know. Yeah, but it's a cinematic story today.
Yeah, that's what I'm here to do.
Henry Sibley's from Detroit, which
yes.
in the early 1800s, it's a western city. It's a cosmopolitan city, though. It's certainly not like a Boston or a New York by any means, but there is a layer of Yankee.
Cop that, Detroit.
But in the 1820s, there's a layer of Yankee elites that Henry Sibley, as a young man, grows up living amongst. On top of a social hierarchy that includes some traders, some African Americans, and some indigenous people as well living in Detroit. But on the very top, men like Henry Sibley grow up. His dad, Solomon Sibley, was Chief Justice of the Michigan Territorial Supreme Court, pillar of the community type, lawyer, politician. Sibley dreamed as a young man of joining up with the military at West Point, but he couldn't make it work. His application was rejected. So he wasn't interested in being a lawyer like his dad, and his family wasn't excited about him going west to work with the fur company. But at the age of 19, Henry Sibley, this young, budding aristocrat from Detroit, signs on with the AFC to, as Wingerd describes it, seek adventure and romance on the frontier. That's the beginning of a long career for Sibley in Minnesota, what would become his home for the rest of his life.
So Sibley starts out basically as a company clerk for the American Fur Company. But after 5 years doing that, and he's kind of spinning his wheels there, he's bored, he's moody, he's a young adult, he's not super duper happy, he's experiencing the world, but Sibley is an ambitious guy. And luckily, Ramsey Crooks, a higher up at the American Fur Company, reached out to Sibley. Quote, Crooks proposed to make Sibley a junior partner with Hercules, Dowsman, and Joe Rolette, who together made a formidable team. The gentlemanly Dowsman with his executive skills, and Rolette, a wily, rough-shod veteran of the trade with the wisdom of experience, would handle operations from Prairie du Chien. Sibley would be posted to Mendota and have independent management of the Western outfit, which encompassed the Dakota trade north of Lake Pepin and throughout the St. Peter or the Minnesota River Valley. To the 24-year-old Sibley, it seemed the opportunity of a lifetime. He signed a 6-year contract, fully expecting to fulfill his dreams of adventure, make a sizable fortune, then return in glory to Detroit. He never imagined that events would conspire to keep him in Minnesota for the rest of his days. End quote.
That's right. So he comes to Minnesota, and he gets his sense of the world that this place is. He meets a guy named Lawrence Toliver, who's, I think, the other important person to understand in this period. Lawrence Toliver is the appointed by James Madison, President Madison, Indian agent for the area. His name is spelled Taliaferro, but it is pronounced Toliver.
So it's read as Lawrence Taliaferro, which is also very cool and very French sounding, but it is actually Toliver, which sounds like you're mispronouncing a Charles Dickens musical. So.
That's right. He's a Virginian. He's a Virginian slaveholder, aristocrat, deeply baked into that society and culture, sent all the way up north to western Minnesota to manage relationships between the Indians and the fur traders. And generally speaking, he devotes himself pretty fully to the job. By the end of the 19th century, being an Indian agent is essentially a license to practice corruption. But at this point, Lawrence Toliver is, he's Wingerd praises him for being pretty dutiful to the to his requirements in terms of being a person operating with integrity. But, she writes, he has a sense of paternalism and race consciousness bred into his bones. Quoting from Wingerd, he regarded Indians as inherently inferior, children who lacked the ability to make decisions for themselves. He never doubted that his natural superiority as a white man and a gentleman granted him the duty and the right to look out for their interests as he determined was best. And crucially, you might be thinking, well, I mean, that's just what white people were back then. That's just how it was. Wingerd, this is a point that we've made in other episodes, and Wingerd makes it explicitly here. Quote, this was a radical departure from the rough egalitarianism that had characterized earlier interactions between whites and Indians, end quote. With this, the Southern, the Eastern, the Yankee, the United States culture coming into the area, they're bringing in a new ideology of race that is distinct from the way that things were operated for the hundreds of years in which the French Catholic, primarily fur trade, operated in Minnesota. And Toliver is very anti-fur traders as well.
Sorry, Logan, before you go on, I think you might need to do a little edit here. You kind of struggled on the word egalitarianism. That is actually pronounced Toliver.
Great work, Sam. Good stuff.
Thank you. I feel good. I've been listening to a lot of potty.
Great, and there it is, and it's gone, and the
all right.
Their professionalism's gone. All right.
Yep. No, I was listening to a lot of comedy podcasts in preparation for this, but apparently they are potty.
Toliver's anti-whiskey. Toliver's big war is making sure that whiskey smuggling is tampered. He wants to stop it. It's the best way to put it. Not super effective, because, like we talked about in an earlier episode, the trade of whiskey has at this point become so enmeshed in the culture of the indigenous and fur trading peoples that it's a lost cause essentially.
Yeah, are we Wisconsin territory yet?
We very well may be. If you're about to make a joke about whiskey, there you go. Great.
Yeah, or just all right. Well, it would be better if I knew what was going on. So
it's okay. I'm gonna just talk about one more character, and we're wrapping up our ideas, I think, here. Mm-hmm. The American Fur Company was the most frequent target of Toliver's wrath, Wingerd writes on page 96, and no one angered the major more than trader Alexis Bailey. Toliver is well aware that Bailey flagrantly smuggled whiskey into the region, contravening the major's orders. The son of a French-Canadian father and mixed-blood mother, Bailey may have exacerbated the major's dislike by his suspect background and uncivilized lifestyle. Alexis Bailey is an interesting character. He's closely tied to Sibley, closely tied to traders like Alexander Faribault, a slave owner as well. Alexis Bailey purchased, we know, at least one slave woman in Minnesota, along with his wife, Lucy Faribault Bailey. And Alexis, known to be a whiskey smuggler, known to be something of a cruel man, an unscrupulous trader, but incredibly important to the trade at the time as well. And he's going to keep showing up, so remember the name Alexis Bailey. But Alexis Bailey and Toliver's rivalry eventually leads to Ramsay Crooks feeling like Toliver needed to be removed. As he writes, he determined to replace Bailey with someone more compatible with the major. So Toliver's still in there, but Ramsay Crooks wants Toliver out of there, but he can't get him out of there quite yet. So instead, why don't we remove Bailey and put someone else in there? Henry Sibley is the guy he puts in to work with Toliver. Sibley is the more gentlemanly type we've talked about. He's an ambitious young man. He's gentlemanly. He's genteel. And Sibley steps in and begins his life in Minnesota.
Yeah, Wingerd describes Sibley as stopping at outright fraud. And that for Toliver would have been a welcome change. So where are we leaving Minnesota today? We're leaving Minnesota in the early 1820s. And we have more and more people from the east coming to settle in Minnesota, usually for business or for military fortunes. And where that leaves the Dakota is still in the shifting medium zone. Relatively, the Americans so far have kept promises they got, not quite all the things that they wanted from the trade for the land that would become Fort Snelling. But due to the illness that we talked about in previous weeks, and poor hunting conditions and squabbles with the Ojibwe, they need some amount of payment and sustenance, and they think so far, at least, they are getting that from the American traders and the American the single treaty that they kind of sort of signed. And so far, we're still in that point of development. So there's this looming threat of a cultural change coming to the land. But so far, the traders, who are the Dakota's main contact, are against settlement. And so they would be telling the Dakota that much. And we have these emerging characters. We have Lawrence Toliver and really most vitally Henry Sibley here, who is very good with people, very good at manipulating power for his advancement, but still maintaining those personal relationships. But something big is coming up the river in the next chapter. In the next chapter, everyone is getting their first look at the monstrous belching machine known as the steamboat. That more than anything is the harbinger of change and rapid progression coming to the North Country, which we'll talk about next week.